Okay, well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Mary O'Sullivan, if you haven't already figured that out. Well, first of all, a huge thank you to Lorraine, Bess, and to Olga for everything they did to get me here, both in facilitating my getting here and also encouraging me to come in a most charming and incredibly dedicated, perseverant way. No more details about that. It's a very bad idea to invite somebody to give a 2.5-hour workshop who has just spent 1 year on sabbatical, because I've had what I think was probably the most creative year of my intellectual life, at least in my opinion, since I was a graduate student, since I was where you were. And one of the things, if you talk to any of the students who work with me, they'll tell you in a kind of bored way that Mary's always saying to them that they shouldn't be in too much of a rush to get out, that it will never be as good as they have it again. And I really mean that, and it hasn't been as good as I got it when I was in my PhD until last year. But last year was very inspiring. I was in Berlin. I was at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, and I was working on a rather immodestly titled project called Capital in Capitalism. And it's kind of ironic, but I will eventually write a book. I have a title already, which is called The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Capital. And if anybody knows George Bernard Shaw, you will understand the irony in that. He also wrote a book called The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Capitalism and Socialism, but I think it's about time that a woman wrote that book. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit crazy. One of the ways I get around having too much to say is by speaking extremely fast. I'm from Dublin, and I think the only people who speak as fast as people from Dublin are people from Bombay. So if it's out of control, do this to try and slow me down, and I promise you I'll pay no attention whatsoever. So I'm going to try and proceed in 3 different parts. The first part is to talk about the role of capital, the emergence of a concept of capital, a settled upon, agreed upon concept of capital in economic theory. So I'm going to take you back, not as far back as Eric took you, but back to the middle of the 18th century, which is a way of summarizing the early part of economic theory and its development. I'm going to start with that. And Lorraine just asked me at lunch, so why do we need to go back to talk about capital? And I hope to try and persuade you that there's some value in that. Then I'll have a short section, which is about capital in economic history, which looks at the way in which capital has been understood in quantitative terms predominantly. And then the third part, which is the part I'm most excited about, is I'm going to try to show you that there are ways of thinking about and studying capital and its role in today's capitalism. I'm going to use the example of retailing, that actually tell us a lot about how to be critical of capitalism today. And you'll see I'm largely critical. The words I won't use very much are innovation, but I think at the end of my talk you'll get a sense of why I'm reluctant. It's a word I've used a lot in my writing, but why I'm wary of using that word, and perhaps we might have a discussion about that. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say before I start talking about capital and economic theory is that though Bill Janeway and I agree on a lot of things, we disagree about economics, or where it's going and how happy we should be about that. I'm much less confident about economics today. I think the problems of economics, the discipline of economics, are still very deeply rooted. And I don't think they're going to be solved by admitting that markets can be inefficient just as well as efficient. To me, these problems go to the very heart of what allows economists, mainstream economists I mean more specifically, to even pretend that they are scientists, when what they really are, in my view, is philosophers, even novelists, although they often write in mathematics, not in prose. I also think that the methodological challenges of improving on this economics are not so complex. The work to be done, especially the empirical work, is very hard, but it's not terribly complex. And that's partly why I think a lot of economists disdain it. They don't want to do it because it's not complex enough. So I'll try and make those points have some more meaning in the course of the talk, and I'm happy to come back to them at the end too. So let me start off with capital and economic theory. Now, there's a lot of talk about capitalism today. And when we read this talk about capitalism, we find something that we find when we talk about it among ourselves, at least if we were a slightly more diverse audience, and there are good reasons why we're not. Many people have strong views about capitalism, but they are as diverse as they are unequivocal. To some, it's the fount of innovation. To others, it spawns exploitation and inequality. To some small group of people, it's possible that both occur. Now, you can see this. I happen to take US press sources. You can see this in Germany. You can see it in France. You can see it anywhere you go. The same kind of polarized discussion. But in many ways, there's nothing surprising about this. Insofar as capitalism's polemical quality is concerned, the term was born in the mid-19th century as a term of critique, as a term of resistance. It was used by Louis Blanc to protest a system that he abhorred. But socialists did not exercise a monopoly over this term for a long time. And eventually, the concept came to be evoked both to celebrate and lament the economic system by a cast of characters as various as Louis Blanc, Max Weber, the New York Stock Exchange, Joseph Goebbels, Eric Williams, Ayn Rand, and Michael Moore. For that reason, a lot of scientists think we should keep away from this concept. It's a polemical concept, and worse still, it's often a vague concept. When people use the term capitalism, they often don't define it. Worse still, when they do define it to be some collection of wage labor, private property, commodification, and capital, much of what we know about economic history seems to challenge arguments made about a special phase of economic evolution which we might label capitalism. It seems that, for example, investment and capital goes back to ancient Rome, for example. It seems we can find early examples of commodification that far predate any conventional dating of the beginnings of capitalism. And so many economic historians, and many economists too, see capitalism as a concept to eschew, keep away from it altogether, or eviscerate it. Use it in a way that really has no substantive meaning, that makes it in some sense the market economy. Now, I take a different view in defense of capitalism. By this I mean the concept of capitalism, not the actual real-life institutional constellation we associate it with. Capitalism's conceptual potential for me stems precisely from its polemical quality. What do I mean about that? If you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes politics. And this is certainly true about these alternatives, which are the standard alternatives for describing our economic system. Now, I'm not going to go through a series of slides to try and prove you that these are not even descriptively accurate in a remote sense, but this one, I think, in some sense captures enough of what I'm thinking about. So this is what we might call a competitive market economy. This is the United States, and we're looking at the concentration of investment spending by the largest firms. Now, what most people are struck by when they look at this picture is this downward movement. If you look at 1950, which is where the chart begins, you'll see that the top 200 firms accounted for almost 100% of investment spending. There's been a sharp decrease in this regard from 1950 on. This is not very surprising. What strikes me about this picture is this. We see a leveling off with the top 200 firms still accounting for more than 70% of all investment spending in one of the most important economies in the world. We have no theories that remotely accord with these descriptions that could explain why this would be so over such an enduring period of time. You can do the same kind of analysis with profits. In fact, it's even more striking, as work I think Bill was referring to by David Autor has shown, where you see an increase in the share of profits going to the very largest firms. Now, I'm not trying to explain this picture. I'm just trying to say that perhaps it makes more sense to use a concept that doesn't allow us to ignore the balance between powerful organizations and less powerful individuals, between public and social control and private initiative, that really characterizes the economies that we live in. The second reason why I think we shouldn't give up on capitalism too quickly is that as an empirical, for the use in empirical work, the potential of this concept is that it allows us to focus our attention on what is undeniably a period of dramatic and consequential socioeconomic change. That socioeconomic change is not described in this picture. This picture simply evokes it. Here what you're looking at is subsistence, income relative to cost of subsistence in London and Beijing, two cities, over the very, very long run. This is based on a basket of goods that allows you to survive. And what you find here is what you've all heard of course, the Great Divergence. Both the Great Enrichment and the Great Divergence. Something really important happens in the last few centuries. Let me be really vague about it. This is probably something we want to understand. It went along with enrichment. It also went along with many other things too. Some of them good, some of them not so good. So my starting point is that the concept of capitalism is an interesting and useful one, at least potentially. Why do I say potentially? Because there are problems with the way in which we define capitalism. There are problems with the theoretical underpinnings of this idea of capitalism from an economic point of view. So if you want to use it to make use of it in economic analysis, we have to confront those problems, those conceptual problems. So here you see, in some sense, a statement of the obvious, but not necessarily so obvious, because a lot of people who use the term capitalism outside economics and fewer of them inside economics don't take it seriously. So Eli Heckscher said, even at that time, this notion of capitalism was seen as being very vague and problematic. And he said, look, you want to use this, modern capitalism, well, then we've got to come up with a clear conceptual understanding of it, and shouldn't that, after all, start with capital? How can we have a theory of capitalism if we don't understand the role of capital within it? That doesn't mean that once you have a theory of capital that you have enough to understand capitalism. There is more that you need to explain, not least wage labor. But this seems like a good starting point. Now, what he suggests, as you see, is something quite specific. He says, let's connect our analysis of capitalism to what is called in economic science the science of capital. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And as you'll see, that's already too much. And what I'm going to try and convince you of is the following. If, as Heckscher, I think, reasonably suggests, it's capital should give meaning to capitalism, it's not clear what that meaning would be. Why? Economists have worked on capital a great deal. They've made sustained, though sporadic efforts over more than 2 centuries to develop an economic theory of capital. But their efforts have spawned enormous contention and confusion within the discipline, and more precisely within the mainstream of the discipline. To the point, I would argue, where the economic science of capital is itself an unwholesome Irish stew. So Heckscher's recommendation, in some sense, falls apart in the face of this muddle. Now, in trying to convince you of this, the question is, of course, which economists am I going to use to show the problems? And hopefully I'm going to surprise you a little bit here. The first question is, where should I start? And that's a very good question, because we can go back very far in time and find discussions of money, of credit and interest, from the medieval period through the early modern period, and indeed well before that in the work of Aristotle or his student. When capital featured, and it often did, it was treated in a very taken for granted way. Capital was obvious, capital was there, it was used. It was almost always assigned a monetary meaning. It meant actual money or claims to money or some goods evaluated in money. There was a lot of discussion about this, the legitimacy of making money, debates on usury. That was not new, and it really was a discussion. This was true even in the medieval period. Giacomo is to a friend of mine who's a medieval historian who's written a lot about how arguments about usury were challenged by the Catholic Church even, and eventually won out in terms of the debate. But what we don't find is what you might call, or what Schumpeter called, an articulate analysis involving a theory of the nature and the functions, and one could add, and the rewards of capital. We don't find that until the 18th century. And we begin to find that in the work of people like Richard Cantillon. We find it in the work of the physiocrats in France. And we find it, of course, most famously in Scotland. We find it in the work of David Hume, and we find it in the most elaborate form in the work of Adam Smith, influenced, of course, by his friend David Hume, as well as by the physiocrats. So I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to take you a little bit of the way into the history of economic thought, but I want to say a word about how I'm going to do that. Some of you may have seen the survey conducted in the early 2000s by David Calander. He found that 77% of economics graduate students in elite programs in the United States agree with the following statement: economics is the most scientific of the social sciences. And they're not alone in that belief. Prominent economist Ed Lazier wrote in 2000, and I quote, "By almost any market test, economics is the premier social science. The ascension of economics results from the fact that our discipline has a rigorous language that allows complicated concepts to be written in relatively simple, abstract terms. The language permits economists to strip away complexity. Complexity adds to the richness of description, but it prevents the analyst from seeing what is essential." What I'm going to sketch for you is the emergence of a disciplined idea about what capital is, what I call the emergence of a canon of capital in the mainstream of the economics discipline. What I mean by a canon is the body of rules, principles, or standards accepted as axiomatic within the economics discipline for the study of capital. What that means is I will emphasize the work of those who have shaped that canon. The economic thinkers whose ideas about capital have gained the most traction in shaping the discipline. And that means I'm going to ignore a lot of economic thinkers who you like, and who I like, and who've had interesting things to say about capital. Economists like Thorsten Veblen, like Max Weber, like Joseph Schumpeter, like Rudolf Hilferding, and someone else whose exclusion might even shock you. And my reason for doing so is that I don't need them. I don't need the most radical critics of the economic science of capital to sustain the main observations I want to make about it. So it's a rhetorical device to show you that I don't need Marx to show that the canon of capital in economics is a stew. Now, I said I would start with Smith, and I will. There are many things that are worth knowing about Smith, but perhaps the most important thing to know about him was captured well by Schumpeter in his History of Economic Thought, when he says, no matter what he actually learned or failed to learn from predecessors, the wealth of nations does not contain a single analytic idea, principle, or method that was entirely new in 1776. The novelty of Smith is not a specific idea. The novelty of Smith is how he put them all together into a system. That's really what's interesting about him. And from our point of view, it's particularly interesting with respect to capital. Of course, Smith doesn't start with capital. He starts with this idea, Smith's division of labor. For Smith, the increasing specialization of labor, the division of labor as we call it now, is the crucial cause of improvement in the wealth of nations, the flow of annual national product, which is how he understood that idea. But as you see here, straight away, we introduce the notion of a stock. Smith claimed that an advance of stock was necessary to a division of labor, and that further specialization depended on increases in the stock advanced. What was interesting about his work at that time is that even though he was very influenced by the physiocrats, you find the same idea there too, in contrast to the physiocrats who thought that manufacturing was really not a productive activity in the way that agriculture was, Smith was interested in manufacturing. He also thought agriculture was a highly productive activity, but he thought manufacturing was too. And most of his analysis centers on the role of manufacturing. What he meant by manufacturing, by the way, is not factories. He was writing before, at least factories in the way we mean, the mechanized factories, he was writing before that really diffused in a way that he was aware of. So if you read his description of the pin factory, you realize he's talking about what's still fairly artisanal work. There's a specialization of labor, but we're not, certainly not, in the textile mills. Now, he elaborated on this later. You don't need to read the whole quote here, right now at least. He talks in more detail about what he means by a stock. A stock of goods of different kinds must be stored up somewhere sufficient to maintain him, the man who's doing the work, and to supply him with the materials and tools of his work till such time at least as both these events can be brought out. In other words, that he can produce and sell what he's working on. So here you get the origin of the notion of Smith having a physical idea about capital. He's talking about stuff, a stock of goods of different kinds, to supply him with materials and tools, physical things. So now we have at least a conception of the nature of capital, what is capital. Here we move on to the rewards that capital earns. He says the consideration of his own private property is the sole motive which determines the owner of any capital to employ it in agriculture and manufacture. We need profit to give an incentive to someone to invest in the stock. That's pretty clear. And as capitals increase in any country, the profits which can be made by employing them necessarily diminish. There is a competition between capitals. If these are familiar ideas, they should be familiar ideas to you, it's because this has been so influential. So a competition of capitals, profit on capital, competition among profits, and then finally, in one of the most famous passages of The Wealth of Nations, as every individual endeavors as much as he can to employ his capital in support of industry, and so to direct that industry, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He doesn't actually intend to make the annual revenue of the society bigger, but he is led by an invisible hand to promote an end, which was no part of his intention. All he cares about is increasing his own profit, but in doing so, he directs capital into activities that actually serve the greater good. Okay, this is Smith 101. The reason I'm belaboring it is because you see very clearly in it a theory of capital. What does that mean? It means when you ask the question, what's capital? Smith has an answer to the question. I just gave the answer. What economic functions does it perform? Capital produces, but also capital competes. It fights with other capital to make sure that profits go down, inducing new action, new investment in order to make higher profit. So it's a dynamic idea of its functions. What determines the rewards that accrue to capital? So here comes the problem with Smith. Profit is the return paid to the owner of capital for employing it in production. He claims, well, it's kind of like labor. It's the flow of resources that's comparable in economic terms to wages and to rent. That sounds okay till he tries to go further. He describes a competition of profits, but of course the question people asked was, where does that profit settle? What's the level below which profit cannot go? What's the, as he called it, the natural rate of profit? What's the natural rate of profit in Adam Smith's work? And here you start seeing a problem emerging. He says the value which the workmen add to the materials resolves itself into two parts, wages and profits, okay? But now we know this is sensitive, right? Because how that split occurs then becomes important. Then he gives another description of it. And what does this description suggest? Politics. What are the common wages of labor? Well, it depends on the contract between the person with the stock and the person who's doing the work. And he says, well, it's not difficult to foresee who's in charge, who has the negotiating power. If the person with the stock has more power, then they can drive down wages. The contract will be more favorably disposed towards his interests. And in this dithering, Smith opens up a big problem that actually is a big problem for classical economics for the next several decades. Essentially, the problem here is that Smith does not have a theory of the natural rate of profit. He doesn't know where it settles, and the reason he doesn't know whether it settles is because he's not really sure what it's for. Why would profit be higher in one industry than another? Why would it be higher in one industrial activity or another? Does it matter how long it's invested? Does it matter how much is invested? Does it matter how risky the investment is? All the things we would now give as answers to that question, they are not to be really found in Smith in any clear way. He talks about all of those things, but he never really comes out with what you might describe as a convincing theory of the return to capital. And everybody knew that. Everybody knew that But this man made it clearer than anyone else had because he was so clear. Now, David Ricardo had a very different background to Adam Smith. He was not a moral philosopher, as Smith was. He was not a full-time professor. He was a stockbroker. And he was from a family of Portuguese Jews who had moved to Amsterdam and then to London. His father was a stockbroker, and like him, David became a member of the London Stock Exchange. He became estranged from his family for marrying a Unitarian, and he set up in business on his own. And he made a fortune off the Battle of Waterloo. He had set himself up to receive early notification of the results of the battle, and then, to create the impression the French had won, he openly sold his British securities. His actions prompted a panic. He promptly bought up British securities at much reduced prices, and when everybody found out the British won the war, he made a fortune. The problem is you can't continue in stockbroking after doing that, but by then he was so rich he didn't care. So he retired to the English countryside. He became the representative of Parliament for a country he had never visited, my country, Ireland, and he wrote about economics. He read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and it inspired him to do economics, but it also provoked him because he felt that Smith was not clear enough, was not careful enough in his logic. So when he turned to economic inquiry, he wanted to build on and improve on Smith, but according to a method that was much more deductive than Smith. But Ricardo was interested in the world around him to a great extent. You can see that in the titles of his two main contributions to political economy. And he was interested in it because there was a debate going on about tariffs, about the corn laws, about restrictions on the import of corn to Britain, a debate that raged after the Napoleonic Wars. Now, his focus was different from that of Smith. He was especially interested in distribution. Smith was interested in how the wealth of nations was created, in explaining the origins of what we now call productivity growth, which he found in the division of labor. Ricardo explicitly rejected that because he felt that trying to explain these dynamics over the long term was something that was very difficult, very hard to be exact about. And what he wanted to study was the laws that regulate the distribution of that wealth, which is the principal problem of political economy as he saw it. Now, you probably know the basics of the Ricardian system, and I'm just going to summarize them quickly here. And if you don't know them, you just need to spend 20 minutes looking on a basic economics textbook to beef up a little bit. But here's all I need you to know about it for the purposes of what I'm going to say. Ricardo split the world into three classes, pretty obvious: capitalists, landowners, and workers, as concurring in the formation of the produce of industry, close to the Smithian system. He was mainly interested in rent. And why was he interested in rent? Because he was interested in landlords. And why was he interested in landlords? Because he was interested in the corn laws. He focused primarily on developing scientific theory of rent, and he did so based on the principle of diminishing returns to land cultivation. This is based on the notion that the quantity and fertility of land is fixed, it's given, it's God-given, and he makes an argument that rent will come into existence in a word like that in a natural way. What Ricardo was worried about is really what was happening to rents in Britain and what would happen to rents in Britain. He wasn't worried about the wage rate. He took that as exogenous, given. And he was worried about profits, but he treated them as a remainder. He was worried that profits were not going to be high enough to give capitalists the appropriate incentives to invest their capital, as Smith had said they needed to. Why? Because rents, in the Ricardian view, were going to rise and rise and rise and squeeze profits. So in some sense, if you want to think about it this way, Ricardo was worried about the potential exploitation of the capitalist class. That's a little bit of a joke. What he's really worried about is profits getting squeezed down to a level where you have under-incentives for investment in manufacturing. But what we don't see in Ricardo is any attempt to deal with the problem of Smith with regard to profits. What were profits? What should the right level of profits be? He never really gets at this issue. right? He just gets at the concern that they wouldn't be high enough. But again, we have no theory of the natural rate of profit. Profits are just what's left over. Now, Ricardo was the capitalist advocate against the landlords. He assumed that capitalists are motivated by profit. Their accumulation contributed to economic progress. That's pure Smith. As rents went up, that's more or less what I said. But it's even less clear in Ricardo than in Smith about what capitalists contributed to national wealth. Why exactly were they getting profits? He doesn't do anything new with respect to Smith. And exactly what should the level be in a properly functioning economy. If you go through other classical economists who come afterwards, you find this struggle becoming more explicit. In the work of Nassau Sr., he starts talking about an idea that we hear a great deal about in the 19th century, often with a very strong moral overtone, the notion that capitalist contribution came through his postponement of enjoyment or abstinence, which allows for the stock to be accumulated. They get rewarded for it because they're doing something kind of painful in order to allow this to happen, and therefore they need to be rewarded. Remember, this was before the development of marginal utility theory, but consistent with it in some sense. So again, what they're trying to identify is some function or activity that is analogous to the actual work that people do in order to get wages. Marx just trashes this idea, talking about all the rich people in Britain who are the capitalists abstaining from consumption when in fact their problem is overconsumption. Right? So you're doing them a favor by allowing them to consume less so that they are not as fat as they would be otherwise. Longfield had the idea that maybe competition reduces profit to a lower limit determined by the efficiency of that capital, which without imprudence is employed in the least efficient manner. Nonsense. Blah, blah. If a student wrote this in a PhD dissertation, you throw it out. It means nothing. It's just words put together in a sentence. But it doesn't actually mean anything until you define what that word means, what this word means, and what that word means. It doesn't have any meaning. So if you can explain what capital is, how you invest that in an efficient manner, then maybe you can get somewhere, but otherwise not. The best is John Stuart Mill. If you read through all of the editions of Principles, you'll find a different version of the explanation of why capital earns a return called profit. He starts off by saying it's an unsettled question, and he ends up saying it's pretty much everything. Prudence, imprudence. What's important about this for us is that this opens up. They go looking for the problem of criticism, of which there is an onslaught in the 19th century. They are hit from every side, the classical economists, I mean. And they're hit in the first instance by, not surprisingly, a group we call the Ricardian socialists. Why are they called the Ricardian socialists? Because they pick up on the clarity of this incoherence in Ricardo's work, and they blow it up into a theory of exploitation. So here is one example, Thomas Hodgkin. He says wages vary inversely as profits, pure Smith. Or wages rise when profits fall, and profit rise when wages falls. Therefore, profits are the capitalist share of the national product, which is opposed to wages, the share of the labor. That's logic based on Smith and Ricardo. You can get that in Smith and Ricardo. So capital has no just claim to the large share of the national produce now bestowed on it. These people are often criticized for not being economically sophisticated, and there's something to that argument, but they didn't need to be. They didn't have any real alternative theory of profit other than it was part of labor share. It was kind of a labor theory of value in a very simple sense. Now, Marx, of course, uses these Ricardian socialists, criticizes them, and goes beyond them. But as I warned you, I actually don't need him to make the point. This is the exclusion that might shock you. Most Marxists don't have any sense of humor, so they don't understand the irony of talking about capital and economic theory by excluding Marx, but hopefully you do have a sense of humor. Because I have another group of revolutionaries who had the same problem with classical economics, and that's perhaps more surprising. So here is William Stanley Jevons, one of the early marginalists. He's not a revolutionary in the sense of Marx, but he is a revolutionary in another sense. So what he says is, the current doctrines of economics, by which he means classical economics, determines the rate of profit in a very simple manner. Produce equals profit in wages. Such a doctrine is radically fallacious. It involves the attempt to determine two unknown quantities from one equation. You don't need to do much algebra to know you can't do that. Here is really where you see his revolutionary objectives. He laments the noxious influence of authority. It's a positive service to break the monotonous repetition of current questionable doctrines, even at the risk of new error. Classical economics, in his view, needs to be pulled down and replaced with something new. One of the problems, I think, with a lot of critique of mainstream economics is that we slide easily from classical to neoclassical as if these are all part of some mainstream, which they are. But this does not become the mainstream until there's been a huge fight within economics in order to determine that there will be a successor to classical economics. Jevons is very much a part of this, but he's not the only one, of course. And so the transformation of economics that ends up being called the transition to neoclassical economics, though later that name comes to be used, what we mean by that is the systemic transformation in economic thinking that followed the incorporation of the concept of marginal utility by Jevons, but also by Walras and Carl Menger. Now, this process begins in the early 1870s. Then some of the really important ideas, it becomes clear that they're being developed not just by one person, I think that's quite important, but by different people working in some cases in contact with each other, in other cases not at all. Now, the first phase of this is in some sense the easy phase. Easy to say now from a distance, of course. But it resulted in models of exchange that shifted the explanation of prices away from the classical focus on production to consumption. That's the first challenge, as the marginalists see it, to explain prices in different terms. More precisely, this should be very familiar to all of you, marginalists analyze the price of a good as an interaction between the available supply of good and its marginal utility to the consumer. Though you're all familiar with that idea, just pay attention to the assumptions you need to make it operate. Here are the two assumptions. Valuable goods are in scarce supply. And the one that's going to be of more importance to me, the law of diminishing marginal utility, which has, in some sense, a fairly commonsensical basis, at least at the first thinking. Eventually, when you consume something enough, the extra utility you get from consuming more of it begins to decline. This is not a crazy idea. We can see why that might make sense. The problem comes, though, in extending this kind of logic to become a more general logic. Because in the end, it's not enough if you can only explain prices. You have a new consumer theory. The objective of the Jevons and the Mengers and the Walras is really to come up with a new theory of the economic system as a whole. And what that meant was crucial, was that they needed to explain production. So what we see happening, and hints of it emerge pretty early on, is people playing around with the question of how might production be incorporated into this new model. How might we end up with the application of a fairly analogous logic to pull production in? And Menger pointed the way by saying, well, maybe the means of production, what we now might call the factors of production, could be thought about in kind of similar way, that they yield indirect satisfaction, and so maybe they could be incorporated. So he hints at the direction, and eventually we do get a situation, as you well know, in which labor, land, and capital were portrayed as factors of production, and their income streams, wages, rent, and interest, are seen to be the prices for their productive services as determined through the logic, marginal logic. The question is, how did they do that? This took a major leap. A major leap that people are really only beginning to pay enough attention to, in my view, in the last 10 years. What they did to extend marginal analysis to production, they needed some equivalent to the diminishing marginal utility of the consumer. And where they found it is in the law that Ricardo had used for land. There was a second wave of marginalists involved in the effort. These are different names, as you'll see. And as you'll see here from a letter from one to another of them, this is Eugen Bimbaver to John Bates Clark. He says, please receive my sincere thanks for your letter. I have read your articles with great interest. Our analyses of capital and labor have many similarities, so we're talking just at the moment when this is happening. We're both convinced the problem of interest and wages must be solved simultaneously, and we both have the same theoretical starting point, the theory of final utility. It is the commitment to marginalism. Our approaches are similar in many respects, including the extension of the law of the diminishing returns to the field of production. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, Ricardo had used it to talk about land. But what was the basis of that law in land? Two things. One is that the supply of land was given and fixed, and secondly, that its fertility was given and fixed. Now, are those two assumptions correct for the case of land? Possibly, but people argue. And why do they argue? Because they say, well, man can increase the fertility of land and actually reduce it too through over-cultivation. But certainly man can increase the fertility of land, and actually, ironically, after Ricardo wrote, that's precisely what happened in British agriculture. You see a huge increase in productivity precisely because, not necessarily machinery, but of other types of innovations in the use of land. Whether or not it can be used in the sense in which we might mean a law to be applied to land, what many people were clear about in 1815, 1820, 1825, that this law did not apply to manufacturing. Because in manufacturing, innovation was possible, all kinds of productivity improvements were possible. This could not possibly explain what happened in manufacturing. As you see here, though, the marginalists didn't spend much time dwelling on the question of whether empirically this was a reasonable assumption or not. They made it because it offered such an attractive parallel in the field of production. And they allowed themselves this extension by use of a clever device. They started talking much more explicitly about diminishing marginal productivity. Ricardo's kind of vague on that, whether he's talking about diminishing average or marginal productivity. Why does it matter? Because they gave examples of a machine. They said the machine is fixed, but the labor can move, change, increase. And they set up this thought experiment where you imagine the machine. One man came to operate the machine. 2 men came to operate the machine. Once you get up to 52 men coming to operate the machine, you get this massive overcrowding. So in using this in a marginal sense, they seemed to make it plausible, a kind of intellectual invention in order to persuade. So this was crucial to the whole thing working, the extension working, and the extension brought enormous benefits. You all know this picture. This is a supply and demand curves for interest. This was not drawn right at the time when John Bates Clark and Bumbaverk were debating this. This is drawn later by Irving Fisher, but it's still in the same logical movement that we find Clark and Bumbaverk. And they talk about it already in these terms. So they didn't have the picture, but that's true of a lot of the emergence of neoclassical economics. We see this, so analytical precision that it offered seemed incredibly attractive. And, most importantly of all, the ideological benefit of this was massive. Because, of course, if your produce is split between profit and wages, and what makes the difference is the power of the capitalists, this is an ideologically extremely problematic state of affairs for the discipline of economics to be in. And so here, with this logic, they end up with something that J.B. Clark in particular touted over and over again. Now, interest can be adjusted by free bargaining, sure, but in the end, it naturally tends to equal the fractional product that is separately traceable to capital. Every man gets what he contributes to production, in a marginal sense, of course. Every man gets what he contributes to production, and so now we have an answer, it seems, to the question that was posed by Adam Smith. At least, what's the natural rate of the return to capital? At least if you buy all of the paraphernalia behind it that are needed to generate it. Now, the one big cost that went with this, and you can see it, I don't know whether you've noticed that there's been a shift in the word we're using. We were talking about profit, and in fact, Smith was quite explicit about that. Interest was a derivative income. If you had no profit, that was a primary income, bankers could earn no interest. He was very clear about that. In an economy in which there was no profit, there was also no interest, therefore. Now we have slippage. Profit's gone, and interest is now the return to capital. Why is that? And the reason this is of course, the diminishing marginal productivity of capital may make sense in no world, but it couldn't possibly make sense in a dynamic world. Once you allow technologies to change, this becomes a very problematic idea. So they couldn't let that happen. And here's Walras on the point. In a state of equilibrium in production, entrepreneurs don't make profit or loss. That's the world we're interested in. They make their living not as entrepreneurs. What they do is they don't, as far as profit is concerned, in the sense of profit of enterprise, what the English classical school fails to see is that they balance out profits and losses once the economy settles down to equilibrium. What they're saying here is that let's leave those problems of the out of equilibrium state aside. Theoretically, it's to be left in the margins, not to pun too much. So this, in some sense, is the break that we often talk about in terms of the focus on steady states rather than the long term. That also defines a big difference between classical and what we've come to call neoclassical economics. So you can think of these as costs as well. And in fact, interestingly, some of the early marginalists saw it precisely that way. Walras was perhaps less concerned, but John Bates Clark always promised a book on the dynamics of the economic system. He didn't think it should be left in the margins, but he never wrote the book. So his priority was the steady state. More importantly, for my purposes, is that this apparent agreement on how capital was to be treated by these marginalists didn't last for hardly any time. In fact, it never even existed. So even among these, what I call doctrinal friends, Böhm-Bawerk, Clark, Fisher, there was fundamental disagreement. And this is why I call capital a scientific Irish stew. Now, let me try and show you why. Here is a classic example. You'll probably read this. These are men digging a hole. Each of them has a spade. For the purpose of marginal analysis, I add a man. What's the problem? He has no spade. The question is, what's the marginal product of labor? Now the question is, what's the marginal product of capital? What's the problem? He has no man. There's a spade, but no man. This leads to the puzzle of whether, in fact, in this production process, you need a man and a spade. If that's true, then even on the margin, their products are inseparable. Capital and labor do not have independent marginal products. Now, how do you solve this apparent puzzle? Anyone, any ideas? Because it has to have been solved. Pardon? In English. No, in English. So in other words, you can't use Leontief production or function. Tell me the simplest possible way how you make this.
You can't produce without two of them. That's your corner solution at the end.
Marginal product is zero for if not both are used at the same time.
Okay, but that doesn't really solve the problem, right?
Can make them complement.
I've just given this lecture to 12-year-olds. They're the ones you have to explain the answer to.
You get the complement,
You either make them complements or you create a world where labor is very mobile.
Okay, it's almost, the first one is obviously not acceptable, right? Because you're back in this equation with two unknowns. So you can't do that, or they won't do that. But the second one is right on, except it's not labor, it's capital. Okay, so here's Clark's solution. Capital is perfectly mobile. There is indeed no limit to the ultimate power of capital by changing its forms of embodiment to change its place in the group system of industry. Now, specifically, look what that actually means in his mind. We take away laborers, so we're working in the opposite direction, right? We were increasing, now we're taking them away. We take away laborers, we leave the capital everywhere unchanged in amount. But we change the forms of it in every one of the industries. So we make it accurately fit the needs of the slightly reduced working force. The abandoned pick and shovel become, by a miracle of transmutation, an improvement in the quality of a horse and cart. There are fewer men digging, but they have as much capital as ever they have in the form in which, with their reduced numbers, they can use. So, to go back to the example, you have 5 men and 5 shovels. You add another man, you have no shovel. You take away the other 5 shovels, you turn them, by a miracle of transmutation, into 6 lower quality shovels, and then they can all dig a hole. That's basically what he's saying. Now, if you think that's fantastical, so did Bumbavark. Clark's capital is a quantum of value imputed in material goods. He strips off everything which may suggest material existence and retains only a value jelly, existing eternally, never destroyed. Now, if you're looking at this and you're saying, this is crazy stuff, miraculous transmutation, but actually, when you think about it for a second, all of these things are important. The physical nature of capital and the possibility that capital flows, but it's something that requires explanation. You can't just assume it by a miracle of transmutation. I'm going to take questions in a few minutes. I just want to try and get to the end of what I hope is a reasonable. Now, what Bumbavark suggested, because he was struck by the puzzle too, is he said, let's not think about capital the way Adam Smith did in terms of physical goods. Let's think about it in terms of roundaboutness, the degree of complexity of the production process. And he thought that if you added a marginal bit of capital, you could think about this as increasing the complexity of the production process. It's another way of going after it. It's in some sense closer to the physical reality, but it's still a huge intellectual leap. It's a thought experiment. And essentially what we have in this time is a fundamental disagreement even about what capital is. Not just a fundamental disagreement about definitions, that's not that interesting, but until you agree on this, you can't possibly understand how capital functions. Right? If it's Clark's idea, then the way we can envisage the role of capital in the economy is quite different. We might be more interested in understanding when does capital exit and enter industries than we are interested in understanding which specific capital goods are accumulated by capitalists in order to do business in one industry or another. But the crucial point of this picture is to say that this is the degree of disagreement. It's this fundamental, and we don't have Marx in the picture. Marx had a totally different conception of the nature of capital. It was none of these things. What was it? What did Marx think capital was? It's a social relations, right? So it's not a thing, it's not a fund, it's not. So he has this famous quote, the most, I think, revealing quote about his idea of capital is when he talks about a Negro. He says, what is a Negro? He says, a Negro is a black man. A Negro is not capital, I'm using his language, of course, is not capital until he is put in a social relation that makes him a slave. And then he's capital. So it wasn't in the nature of the, excuse my calling it a thing, it's not in the nature of the thing or the object. It's in the nature of the relation that that person or thing is embedded in. So what we see, Clark was aware of this. They're all aware of this because they were fighting about it all the time. And this is what Clark said. Well, you know, so we all have fundamentally different views about capital, but it's better than plowing along, not realizing. So he, I think quite rightly, acknowledged that implicitly economists had these very different theories of what capital was, even in classical economics. They didn't all agree it was physical, but they hadn't actually got it to the surface, and so therefore they were kind of talking about what they thought was the same thing, but it wasn't. So it's better that that be exposed. However, despite the fact that it was exposed, this was not solved. So the first capital controversy, well, arguably the first capital controversy involves Marx, but in the mainstream of the economics, profession, and I include Veblen because he's really very central to this. Veblen's one of the most important economists in the United States at this time, and Clark, for example, respects him enormously. This capital country plays itself out over several years in the main journals at the time and never resolves itself. More importantly, it comes back again in the 1930s, and this time we have Hayek. And as you see here, the notion that capital is completely mobile, can at will, and without any loss of value, be transformed in any concrete form. But there he's going after the kind of Clark idea. Would be true only if the concrete capital goods were just so many units of homogeneous energy, which could be put to any use. If they were completely non-specific, this corresponds less to reality, blah, blah, blah. That's Hayek. This is Knight, because Hayek kind of at that time bought into a roundaboutness, an Austrian in that sense too. It's extremely difficult to give any intelligible meaning to a period of production, right, on which roundaboutness depends. It certainly has no meaning of the type that Böhm-Bawerk and Hayek give it. And this leads to what he called a mythology of capital. Just empty words, harmful. It's a noxious mythology of capital. You can always rely on Hayek for that kind of language. Sometimes one would miss him. And then this is Frank Knight responding in the most revealing letter I think I've ever read on capital theory. This is 1936, so we're pretty late in the game here. He's writing to Talcott Parsons, sociologist, great sociologist, or at least prominent sociologist. You may or may not have heard echoes of the fact I've become more or less involved in controversy in economic theory, the theory of capital and interest. Controversy referred to, well, just read it. Why am I reading it out? I teach in French, and so I'm used to reading English quotes and translating them, but I'm sorry about that. Treatment of capital productive factors in all my previous teaching is simply wrong. And what he's teaching is what we've just been talking about. The best is here. Speaking of Austrian capital theory, that's concrete capital goods, periods of production, roundaboutness. I'm absolutely convinced such theories are completely wrong. But what is truth? This man's going through a kind of nervous breakdown at this point, which I think is probably enough to convince you that this is a scientific Irish Jew by the 1930s. Okay, let's take a break. Is 5 minutes okay? Yeah? All right. Okay, so I'll get going again. Anyone for a break? You're supposed to not look like this anymore. Okay, so the one thing I want to really zone in on here is this statement. Oh yeah, I have one, I think. Yeah. Is this statement. I'm absolutely convinced that such theories are completely wrong, but what is truth? Now, one way of talking about this is to continue with this debate right up until the present and remain at a theoretical level. If I did that, I would talk about the Cambridge controversies, Joan Robinson, Solow, Samuelson, all of that. I'm not going to do that because I think that in many ways that controversy plays out in different ways and to a more elaborate degree many of the problems that are in some sense endemic in the idea of capital within neoclassical economics from the beginning and acknowledged as such. So I think you already have a kind of good enough grasp of what the issues might be, though I encourage you to look at some of Jeff Harcourt's work, especially a nice little piece that he's written, a joint piece. I think it's in the Journal of, I'll make it available actually, I've forgotten whether it's the Journal of Economic Perspectives, I think it is actually, on these capital controversies, where he brings it right up through the Cambridge controversies. What I want to focus on is this, what's truth? Now, at this time, this is a very troubling question. What is truth? Because this debate is taking place in strictly theoretical, logical terms. So there is no truth. There is no possibility of agreement because each of these men, economists, think of the world in entirely different ways according to different systems, notwithstanding all of their agreement. That's what's so interesting about it. So if you think about this for a while, you say, well, how do we ever teach about capital in our classes as economists if there was so much disagreement. So there's an answer to that, but the answer is an empirical answer. It's not a theoretical answer. So let me try and show you that. And essentially where I'm trying to go is to explain how the canon of capital in the mainstream of economics is as much a response to an empirical challenge as it is a solution to a set of theoretical problems. Right? So it's a kind of agreed on a settlement about a particular way of thinking about capital, largely for empirical purposes. Okay, so to give you a little bit of background. Until now, I said nothing about method, and specifically nothing about empirical method. And that's because I don't need to say anything about empirical method, because for the most part, it's not terribly relevant. That's a little bit of a caricature, but it will do. It's mostly a caricature of Adam Smith, actually, rather than anybody else. Okay, to give you a sense of where economics is, this is Alfred Marshall, a leading marginalist in the UK, arguing that qualitative analysis has done the greater part of its work in the development of what's now beginning to be called the discipline of economics rather than political economy. So from his point of view, this discipline is a qualitative discipline. Again, if you're familiar with economics over the last 30 years, it's kind of weird. It's hard to imagine that was true, but it is true. The most important ideas in classical political economy and then neoclassical economy are developed deductively, or at least without systematic empirical research. The one big exception is Marx, but he's not in any sense well, maybe you could consider him partly classical. So Marshall's pushing for a new direction for economics, a direction in the direction of quantitative analysis. However, this is easier said than done. From Marshall's point of view, what it really requires is reliable, realistic statistics. So that's a huge task in and of itself, but it seems at least straightforward. However, a very the idea of truth through theory and statistics is something that goes way beyond Marshall at this time, and you see this growing impetus to produce better and better statistics. And as you can see here, I've underlined statistics because the statistics that exist at that time are, of course, for the use of the state. And so in certain countries, we have, if you take France, for example, extremely detailed land registries and tax records. We have tariff data. We have certain types of data, but they're constructed for the purposes of managing the state. And so now economists are pushing for a type of arithmetic, which is the old word for it, to be used for the purposes of economics, an economic arithmetic. But figuring out how to relate theory to statistics is a problem that actually Marshall doesn't really acknowledge. But somebody who does acknowledge it is an economist who you should read a lot, not this one. This is, I think, the most influential female writer on capitalism. And she says, it's a curious fact, in spite of the practical nature of their science, political economists are oddly unable to relate their abstractions to the concretes of actual existence. This is the problem of relating empirical evidence to theory and statistics to theory more precisely. Anyone know who this is? Absolutely not. Show your ideological bias. Just because she's bad politics doesn't mean she's an idiot. Okay. More usefully, perhaps, this is Wesley Clare Mitchell, a brilliant economist, first head of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a radical in ways that are completely ignored by many people. If you're interested in being a heterodox economist, read everything this man wrote. He is somebody who said, look, it's now 1925. This is his presidential address to the American Economic Association. We are hardly any further along in achieving what Marshall wanted than we were in 1907. This is an amazing statement because World War I had passed in between. And World War I fostered the development of lots of new statistics, precisely because the state was managing the economy in a much more hands-on way. But despite that, we don't see this fusion. And the reason that he gives, Mitchell, is that the theories that have been developed in qualitative ways are inappropriate to being used in relationship to statistics. Why? Because they do not make reference to observable phenomena. Now, Mitchell's writing about this. The other person who's very interesting on this is Hayek. Hayek is also very critical of this, what he sees as an empirical move, this move towards, so he's writing, and he actually attends a class by Wesley Clare Mitchell in the United States, and I think there's something to be written about the exchanges, or the development of Hayek's thinking after that. But what Mitchell here is describing a world in which, if we're really serious about empirical analysis as economists, we've got to be open to theoretical innovation, probably radical theoretical innovation. So many of the ideas we've had in the past may not be appropriate to making this a science, an empirically grounded science. Now, theories that made direct reference to observable phenomena, he was convinced would gain ground in the several different areas that he identified. But he thought especially, I forgot the beginning of the quote there, especially with regard, the quote should start here, to the relation between business and industry, between making money and making goods, or what we might call capitalism. Right? This he was convinced of. He was dead wrong. Okay, this as a prediction was completely wrong. That's not what happened. We didn't end up with radical innovation in terms of the theory. We actually ended up with something quite different. Now, the crucial move for capital theory, this messy area full of disputes, happens here. This is the first stage of the move. Anybody who's trained in economics should know this paper, or at least has heard of the Cobb-Douglas production function. But all you need to do is read the first page and a half of this paper, and you'll see what these people were trying to do. As late as 1928. Did anyone read the first page and a half, or maybe the whole thing? What were Cobb and Douglas trying to do? The answer is kind of on the screen, but yeah. Just say it anyway, because some people can't read fast.
Trying to produce exactly a statistical method that would make this possible.
What do you mean make possible, though?
That we have the problem that right now we have statistical methods that are based on theories that cannot be, I mean, it's a circle in the sense that for example, the total factor productivity is just what the Cobb-Douglas production function cannot explain. But nevertheless, we use it in statistics in order to say that the current theory is right.
Okay, but you're going ahead of the game to figure out how we ended up using them. But what are they trying to do for us, or for back then? What's their, if you take them at their word, what are they trying to do?
So, in a sense, what he said there is that they're using data to support the idea that both labor and capital gets a specific and fixed share of income, and therefore that's justifying, in a sense, the idea that both of them gets their part of the production, and therefore that there are some undisclosed market mechanisms that actually ensure this, exactly like the theory says. So they can skip the explanation of how it actually does, because the data shows that.
Yeah, you're a critical audience. You're a tough audience. I think you have to be a little fairer to them. It seems to me, if you take them at least at their words, what they're saying is, these are theories. They're hypotheses. That already is a big acknowledgement. Let's go look at some data and see, does it matter in the way the theory predicts when you add an extra unit of labor? Does it matter in the way the theory predicts when you add an extra unit of capital? That would test the idea of the marginal productivity of capital or labor, number one, and then let's go look at wages and interest and see, in fact, are the returns of the factors determined by what we find on the production side. Now, you can call this naive because they end up getting used in a different way, but that is what their intention is, at least as it's stated in the paper. And in some ways, it's a massive acknowledgement of the fact that capital theory is a hypothesis. Right? That's what I love about this paper. So then they go through and they have all of these data, and they say, so let's come up with a production function that embodies these assumptions, and then let's try and show how that looks in empirical reality. When this paper comes out, it's trashed. Everybody says this is nonsense. These technical assumptions you make no sense. They're so naive. It's crazy. No technological change. Are you nuts? You're looking over 25 years, 30 years. It makes no sense. So for a while, this paper is highly unsuccessful in some sense. Nobody thinks they've really proved anything until somebody comes along and makes history with this Cobb-Douglas production function. Who is it? More than Samuelson. I mean, how do we use, what's the most powerful use of the Cobb-Douglas production function today, or similar production functions? Where is it used? Think about capital. Okay, so the key name is actually Solo. Okay, so if you go look at Solo, you skip in time. So this is Cobb-Douglas still. This is the Cobb-Douglas production function. And here's Solo on capital growth. And what you see is now embodied as a canon of capital is what he finds in, so this is your critique, right? This is the guy who deserves it, yeah? Is Solo. He does this in 56, I think. Why does he do it? Because America dominates the world in a kind of economic hegemony we ain't ever seen. And their interest in development, they're not interested in their own development, they're interested in everybody else's development. And so growth theory takes off. And this is the way in which the thinking about capital gets embodied in the practice of economists. And Frank Knight having a nervous breakdown because the theory doesn't make any sense to him doesn't really matter anymore. So it gets used as an empirical device, and it gets used, these are the neoclassical, what I call the parables of capital. It's a physical quantity, serves as a factor of production. That's at least the way Solo talks about it. Its productive contribution can be identified and measured independently. That's the separable idea, right? The man and the spade. There are diminishing marginal returns to individual inputs, including capital. A greater quantity of capital leads to a lower marginal product of additional capital. So that becomes what you might call the parables, and in fact, Samuelson has a paper which is pretty much called this, Parables of Capital. So having been used in a critical way by Hayek, this is your mythology of capital. Now, Parables of Capital is perfectly fine. Why? Because as Solo constantly said to Joan Robinson, so it's incoherent. Who cares? It works, more or less. It's theoretically incoherent, but it works. And what he meant by it works in this framing. There is another capital controversy. I've already talked about that. Sorry, Nicola. So from the point of view of what I call the economic history of capital, by which I mean all attempts to measure the function of capital in our economies by mainstream economics, what it leads to is a focus on the quantity of capital, like how much capital is there. Now, immediately you think that, and this is why there were a third round of capital controversy, you say, how could there be a quantity of capital if it's physical? Well, here we get back into the problem of a fund or stuff, right? And this is really what Joan Robinson goes after the other Cambridge for. She says, how can you add it up if it's just machines? And they go, oh, I don't know, use the kind of present value of the machines. And then she says, how do you calculate the present value of the machines? They go through the formula, and she said, but you need the interest rate. How do you explain the interest rate if you've used the interest rate to explain the value of your capital? It's circular. Good point, but she wins the debate and loses the war. So she loses the war because this ends up being the modus operandi of empirical growth accounting. But the huge irony of all of this is that in using capital empirically in this way, where do we end up? We actually end up in this hilarious situation where the conclusion of the analysis, capital doesn't matter for growth, or at least it doesn't matter very much. If you look at the United States, this is the kind of picture you get. This is Abramovitz and David. These are just different long periods. This is output per man hour. This is capital stock per man hour. And this is the part of growth that we can't explain. So this is what we can explain using the change in the capital stock. And this is what Moses Abramovitz called a measure of our own ignorance. Like what's left over that maybe is technological change, maybe is organizational change, maybe who knows what it's maybe. So we get into this ironic situation in which in the most important periods of American economic development, total factor productivity is way more important than capital, as if these two things were separate. Now, there are all kinds of ways that neoclassical economists have tried to get away from this problem, such as, for example, thinking about capital having a lifetime. Right? So you can talk about embodied technological progress in recent vintages of capital. So a lot of people know there are problems with this. For my purposes, what's important is that this way of thinking about capital reduces to a very simple-minded notion of what capital actually is in the economy and how it contributes, or doesn't, to economic development. So you get statements like this from one of the most prominent economic historians in the world, perhaps a fan of Ayn Rand, I'm not sure. A crucial point is the greatly enriched world cannot be explained in any deep way by the accumulation of capital. As economists from Smith through Marx to Thomas Piketty have on the contrary believed, the very word capitalism is based on a scientific mistake. So ironically, the canon of capital leads to the argument that actually capital is not important in capitalism. So I like ironies, but this is the bridge too far. You might say, what about Thomas Piketty? Doesn't he change everything and bring capital back into the center? So I have written so many pages on this man. I kind of look at him and laugh. And he looks at me and laughs too, which is more worrying. If you're interested in knowing in detail some of the issues about the way he measures capital, but especially the way he conceptualizes capital, have a look at that paper called The Confusion of Capital it's in the package or it's on the website or whatever. The lowdown can be said in 2 sentences. He's constructed a lot of interesting data, some uninteresting data too, but he's done a lot of work. And most importantly, he shifted the discussion so that it's now okay to talk about these things by critiquing him, for example. Where he has been much less willing to depart from, wittingly or otherwise, from mainstream economics is in his conception of capital. And in particular, he still needs marginal productivity ideas, right? He plays with them a little bit, and he asks at one point in the book, well, maybe the diminishing marginal productivity of capital actually doesn't really make all that sense. Oh, well, come on, let's move on. So theoretically, he's much more conservative, but you can't do everything, right? So it's already a 700-page book, so this is constructive criticism, but analytically, he doesn't get away from these canons of capital, to my mind at least, enough. So you might say, fine, after all of this, have you anything to contribute that might be seen as constructive? Well, what's to be done? One is, I'm talking about us, me as a person at least. I abandon ship, forget about this stuff. It's just so depressing and horrifying that so much incoherence can survive and proliferate for so long. The second, more obvious one, which is where many of you may be, if you're really close to being an economist, is to seek refuge in other thinkers who've had different things to say about capital, and there are many of them. I think that's a partial answer, but it's only a partial answer. Why? Because with the exception of Marx, and I mean Marx, not Marxians, almost none of this capital theory, heterodox capital theory, well, Schumpeter too, is actually connected to empirical reality. That's a big problem. And so if you look at Marx's work, but Marx wrote a long, long time ago, and much has happened to capital since. He didn't even finish what he wanted to write. So absolutely be inspired, as certainly I am, by heterodox thinkers, but there is no way we can get away from turning convictions into questions, and by that I mean empirical questions. So in the final part of what I'll do, I'm going to show you something that is, well, started out as a hobby. It's a pretty different register to what you've seen already, but it's an attempt to say, okay, let's go study how capital and profit work today. Now, it's kind of quixotic. Rather than asking economists what do they think about capital, let's sort of ask capitalists how capital, what it means for them. And this is the empirical part of the project, actually covers a period of from 1750. I mean, it starts with the world in which Adam Smith lived. It deals with slavery, it deals with potteries, it deals with a variety of different things. Some of these case studies are developed, some of them are just outlined. But I thought that this one, which is by far the most elaborated, might be the most interesting. And I think it probably helps you understand why I think we need to be more cautious in the use of the word innovation, though it's a very useful word to bring us all together, because it usually is a code word for something else. Okay, so I'm going to change the subject in a dramatic way for a few minutes, or it might seem like that, because I'm going to start talking about productivity. But given what I've said about the empirical, the last little section, maybe that won't seem so such a disjuncture. So I'm just going to try and tell you a story about the way in which economists talk about productivity in retailing. And then I'm going to try and back into an analysis of capital and profit in the retailing industry to come out somewhere different from the economists, the mainstream economists. Now, you probably know this. So if there's a holy grail in economics, at least for the study of long-term economies, productivity is it. And the reason productivity is it is for obvious reasons. You can't expect the supply of inputs to increase without C's. And so understanding why the output per unit of input might grow becomes the way we explain sustained long-term growth in living standards over periods of centuries. Now, when this idea seems simple, it's only simple if you try and give it physical meaning. And if you say, okay, or almost physical, one worker, one widget, two workers, 2.5 widgets, that kind of physical meaning. But of course, economists don't mean it quite that way. What they mean is they're interested in the value of the unit too, right? So quality matters. What are you producing? Then it becomes a little bit more difficult to figure out how do you really make this concrete, and more importantly, it becomes quite difficult to figure out how you might measure this. Now, economists, when productivity studies began, were well aware of these problems, but they settled on norms and practices for measuring productivity that people agreed on up to the point where it became possible to do studies of productivity. And when they did those studies, the first studies showed us something very clear across all countries, was that the most important source of productivity growth over the long run, when we talk about 19th and 20th century, was the industrial sector. And so for a long time, economists focused on the industrial sector and what drove productivity, et cetera, until the late 20th century. And the late 20th century, it wasn't that structural change started in the late 20th century, but the service sector became so overwhelmingly important that people began to say, you know, this is going to be a problem because services have always had lower levels of measured productivity and, more importantly, lower rates of productivity growth. So as they take over the economy, we're going to see national productivity growth going down, so rich countries are not going to be able to sustain rising living standards over the long run, right? That's the basic logic. In the 90s, especially in the United States, that seemed to be borne out by the productivity puzzle. Despite lots of new digital technology, we didn't seem to see any change in the productivity data. And so this concern, anxiety people had, began to be borne out, it seemed, and there was a lot of debate about this, especially in the United States, but not just, until the Walmart effect. And what the Walmart effect was where pessimism about US productivity gave way to talk of a miracle in the late 1990s. And crucially, in 2001, a report by the consulting company McKinsey pinpointed the crucial role played by the retail sector in contributing to that productivity miracle. And even more extraordinary is that the company made the claim that it was Walmart, directly and indirectly, that caused the bulk of the productivity acceleration through innovation that increased competitive intensity and diffusion of best practice. Now, why is this unusual? Because most productivity studies until that time were conducted at the national level, with perhaps sectoral analysis, that is, service, manufacturing, agriculture. This was not just McKinsey, in fact. This was McKinsey reporting on the results of a big study that had been conducted in collaboration with McKinsey, but involved all the leading economists working on productivity in the world, like Solow, for example, but many other people. And their mission was to drive productivity analysis down into industries, to start saying, so if you think about someone like Robert Gordon, who was very much part of this, and many European economists too were involved in this effort. So McKinsey is just a private consulting company, but these results carried a bigger weight. Now, that result was widely reported in the US press at the time, but just at the same time, there was pushback on Walmart. You get quotes like this from the Los Angeles Times 2 years after the McKinsey report came out, and this is quite representative. The PBS ran a very scathing documentary on Walmart, and the basic argument was there was discrimination, gender discrimination, low wages, poor conditions, bad benefits, there's a whole list of things leveled against Walmart as criticisms. By the company's own admission, a full-time worker might not be able to support a family on a Walmart paycheck. You also see the squeezing suppliers argument, both at home in the United States and abroad. So you get this standoff between this very laudatory interpretation of the Walmart effect and this really very critical one. Academics rushed in, and a whole series of books were written, many of them edited, but also this one by Charles Fishman, in which geographers, sociologists, urban specialists of all types, historians, all kinds of people contributed to them. The dominant theme was that Walmart was a bad guy. The Walmart effect was a negative effect. The one discipline absent from most of these was economics, with the exception of an old friend of mine called Chris Tilley, who is an expert on low-wage work, or certainly was his main hat at that time. The economists were absent from this, but not for long. There was a surge of quantitative studies on the Walmart effect that sought to put some numbers on the contribution of Walmart to the US economy, and also to identify how different stakeholders benefited or not from Walmart's presence. And these findings are summarized in an important article in 2007 in a prominent place, The Causes and Consequences of Walmart's Growth, in which Basker offered what she called a systematic accounting of what is known about the Walmart's impact on the US and global economy. She concluded in terms that were clearly consistent with the McKinsey interpretation, and with Walmart's own interpretation, of course, that Walmart's technological prowess had made it a major contributor to the overall increase in productivity in the retail sector, and therefore US productivity. Now, she used the kinds of statistics that McKinsey used. This is the version she uses in the paper. It's just sales. And what you see here, you can't even see the side of it, doesn't matter. Sales, you see employment, sales per worker, 82 in 2002. And what you see here is the general merchandising sector as a whole. You see the increase here, growth in sales per worker, and you just see for Walmart, the growth in sales is much more rapid. Okay, what you don't see here is the average for the US economy, which would show that this is more rapid than the average for the US economy. This is a simple way of showing it. There are problems of measuring productivity this way, but for purpose of argument, let's just not focus on those for now. Now, what's interesting about this is the logic of the argument. As she goes on to explain, and she's just summarizing other studies, including her own, Walmart's biggest, most obvious effect is lower prices to consumers, which is always what Walmart itself argued. She argues that even if Walmart has negative effects on workers' rights and workers' benefits, they're compensated for by the much greater benefits it has for consumers, especially because those consumers are often from low-wage families. Right? So from a distributive point of view, one group of poor people does better at the expense of a smaller group of poor people. The idea that this is what capitalism is about is pretty funny. But anyway. And she sort of says, look, even if you're hurt by Walmart, inevitably, this happens, right? The more efficient push out the less efficient. But for the rest of us, this is good, and probably for you too, because you have to get more efficient. So this is the sort of truth versus myth, which turns into a kind of fetishizing of modern retailing. So this becomes a pretty kind of standard language that you'll read in economic journals or from the European Commission or the World Trade Organization. Over the past several decades, the adoption of modern technology represents a substantial advance in productivity, greater product convenience, lower prices. It's happened in the developed world. Let's hope it happens as quickly as possible in the developing world. So what interests me about this rhetoric is that it marginalizes people who oppose modern retailing, right? So they're either parasites, these are workers from Force Ouvrière in France, protesting against poor working conditions, in this case Carrefour. So this is a logic that goes way beyond Walmart, right? Because in each different country, there's a Carrefour, there's an Aldi or a Lidl, or there's whatever you want. They're either parasites or hippies. This is a group from Portland who decided they would divest the city's portfolio of Walmart stock. You know, from this point of view, the truth versus myth, these people just don't understand how capitalism works. They're protectionists. Here are Indian people who run stalls in streets in India protesting the arrival of efforts to bring Walmart into the country. And finally, they're Luddites. Right? You know, how could anyone object to the application of modern technologies to improve productivity and offer lower prices and greater variety? Okay. So what I argue in the paper is that this economists are kind of they're bluffing here, right? So the very confidence with which they talk about the benefits of modern retailing actually conceal a deep found ignorance of how retail capitalism actually works. And in fact, many of them have admitted that, but I want to sort of play it out a little bit so you can see how it works. Now, the problem lies in the models and measures of productivity that are used to make these claims. So, from the minute they uttered these characterizations of Walmart as a model of economic efficiency, it was contested. And interestingly, it was contested by people who knew about the business of the retail industry. And most immediately, critics pointed to competitors, and in particular to Costco wholesale, which was reportedly the one company that Walmart feared at the time. And they said, you know, how come Costco can pay decent wages to retail workers and charge low prices to consumers? Now, decent wages shouldn't be interpreted in an exaggerated way. They're still low wages, but they're better wages. And so the claims were made that Walmart could improve its economic model by acknowledging the high cost of low wages. So that became the slogan. There's a high economic cost of low wages. So this kind of evidence, and I've just taken the evidence from the time, was invoked by people to make these claims. So here's the starting hourly wage for Costco. We don't have the identical data for Walmart at the time, but you see it in the average wage, the difference. Percentage with health insurance, you see the Costco benefit from the point of view of workers. And then the percentage of people who leave after 1 year of employment is relatively low in the case of Costco, relatively high in the case of Walmart. And so the argument was these are costs, right? So the model is costing workers and the model is costing the company. This was the claim. Now, these kinds of arguments about the Costco model and its superiority were made not just by critical economists, but also, and perhaps even more so, by professors at business schools from Wharton to MIT to Harvard Business School, almost launched a campaign against the high cost of low wages. So this was widely discussed, and not surprisingly, some of the most important advocates of the other logic, the economic logic of Walmart's model, fought back. Now this guy is interesting, and some of you may know who he is, Jason Furman. Jason Furman wrote a notorious paper called Walmart, a Progressive Success Story, in which he really lauded this company. And he's interesting because after doing his PhD at Harvard Economics Department, he became an advisor to some successive Democratic governments, and most importantly, the chief economic advisor of President Obama. So he was a progressive. I mean, he was using that word because that's what he saw himself as, a progressive success story. And the article argues, look, Walmart offers low prices to poor people. However, and that's good. However, it doesn't pay a decent wage, and that's bad. But it's not Walmart's problem, it's government's problem. So his only critique of Walmart is that Walmart was constantly using its political campaigns to undermine the possibility of progressive government. he was basically saying, let us pay welfare benefits so that your workers can actually have a decent wage. Now, if that's progressivism today, I think a lot of people will be counted out. And that's, in some sense, that's been Bernie Sanders' critique of parts of the Democratic Party, especially Hillary Clinton, who sat on the board of Walmart. So the way he responded to this criticism is to say, look, you know, Walmart earns a razor-thin profit margin. Even a small increase in its costs would just wipe out Walmart's profits entirely. And he says, you know, the alternative is they raise prices, but then that's going to penalize poor families. So he had, in some sense, a coherent response to the attack. Except what happened? Walmart turned around and said, we're going to raise wages. And Furman saying, well, you know, you can't. You make razor-thin profit margins. How on earth can you raise wages? And this put economists like Furman on the defensive, especially because of the way Walmart CEO described why they did what they did. He said, you know, we got it wrong. We didn't understand the high cost of low wages. And now we understand them, so we're going to try and raise wages. Now, again, don't get too excited. They raised them a little bit. The wages are still very low. But of course, they set in motion a whole debate because Costco followed too, and other retailers followed as well. And of course, the question this begs is, well, if these guys can raise wages by $1, why can't they raise wages to $15, living wage in the United States? And for that matter, why can't Costco do this? And if retail companies could treat their workers better, why not their suppliers? So what we're dealing with here is the question of what are the economic possibilities of contemporary retail capitalism? What defines what wages they can pay or not pay? We're back to the kinds of questions, if you like, that animated classical economists, etc. Now, this question, what are the structural limits on the economic possibilities of retail capitalism? Economists like Furman or Basker had a kind of instinctive reaction that, well, these limits were very constraining. But the problem was, they didn't really know what they're talking about. And disarmingly, they admitted it. Now, this is Furman. Well, I have no ability to judge whether or not this is true, you know, whether they can't pay higher wages. Although given the choice, I trust Walmart to know more about maximizing profits than its critics. It's just his ideological preference, right? But what's interesting here is he says, I haven't the faintest idea how much profits Walmart needs to make and therefore how much wages it could pay. He sort of says, well, we don't know. This, in a slightly less disarmingly honest way, comes from Basker in the same article. Now remember what the title of it is, The Causes and Consequences of Walmart's Growth. While Walmart's advantage over other retailers has been undisputed for some time, the sources and magnitude of this advantage are not fully understood. That usually means not understood at all. Now she, Emma Basker, to be fair to her, gets closer than any other economist working on these issues to answering that question. And this is what she says. By all accounts, technology and scale are at the core of Walmart's advantage over its rivals. Walmart's better technology has allowed it to grow, but then that becomes circular, so it's not really growth or scale that's the source. It's technology that allows the growth and the growth that allows. So she, quite rightly, zones in on technology. Okay, sounds plausible. We've heard that kind of argument before, except when you go looking for evidence on technology and its role in the productivity growth, even of the retail industry, but certainly of Walmart, there is not one shred of evidence to show that. Not one shred. And you can see that here, 2012 paper, this paper takes a first step towards achieving a better understanding of the effect of technology on the retail sector by investigating what? The impact of barcode scanners, which goes back to the 70s, even earlier in some cases. So we don't even know how useful barcode scanners were in raising productivity. Why is that important? Because it's not so obvious they did raise productivity. In fact, one of the early movers in barcode technology for retailing is in Switzerland, and they abandoned the experiment because it reduced productivity. So we would want to see evidence something happened because they adopted them. The question is, how did this work? So economists on this topic are speaking with enormous confidence about retail productivity, the importance of technology, the greatness of Walmart, but when you get down to it and really dig into the evidence, you find that they don't have the evidence, not even close to the evidence, to make these claims. And funnily enough, they admit that if you go and read the work carefully. Now, you might say, well, Walmart probably is better at using barcode scanners than others. This is a kind of a joke, but we'll do it anyway. Turns out maybe not. Now, a very unkind thing to do is to go on YouTube and put in Walmart speedy scanners, and you get these hysterically nasty videos of really slow Walmart scanners. And I didn't show them to you because I actually think it is kind of unkind. But the point of this is, if you go and actually start looking around retail trade magazines to figure out who is really good at scanning fast, it's rarely Walmart that comes out of this. Now, I'm going to relativize scanning technology in a second, but let me go with this for a second. So this is an article that came out. I don't normally read The Sun, but I couldn't resist it this time. And Aldi here is talking about the fact that its staff can scan items at some phenomenal rate, 2,000 per, I can't remember what even. But here's an interesting point. These are comments by Aldi shoppers. All right, I'm going somewhere with this. So Aldi itself recognizes this, and what's this about? This is about speed scanning items is not the same thing as better service. And this is particularly the case in Europe. Why? What's the difference between Europe and the United States if you think about scanning speed? Why are these shoppers stressed out? These are UK shoppers.
They don't give up bags.
Huh?
They don't give up bags.
No, close though. They don't give out bags. That's not the problem. That's right. So European shoppers, for the most part, pack their own bags. So that's why it's stressful, because the things are spitting out, and you're kind of trying, right? So your work is intensified, not just the scanner. And whereas in Walmart, they pack the bags. Okay, so now the importance of that is, first of all, scanning speed. Simple measures of technological performance do not translate into improved economic performance, as in economic measures of services. But perhaps more important, there's big structural differences across modern retailing. In the case of Europe, what's happened is retailers have eliminated services they consider to be marginal, packing bags, but they're incorporated in retail service in the United States. I'm just using a very simple example to make a bigger point, which is that there's a difference between productivity we do or can measure and what we might call retail service. Now, again, all of this stuff is recognized. Just the implications are not necessarily drawn. And so what's funny about this is that this appeared already in 1991, where these two guys, Bailey and Solo, were absolutely shocked, because when they looked at cross-national data on retail productivity, who did they find was the most productive nation in the world in terms of retail, way ahead of the United States? France. And they said France could not possibly be the most productive country in the world in anything. And so they tried to come up with an explanation, and this was the explanation. They said there's a systematic tendency for their productivity to be overstated because they've eliminated. But the bigger point is a much more important point. Well, first of all, if you shop in Carrefour, they do go that fast. They really are productive. So intensification of work in retail outlets in France is a huge issue. But there's a huge difference, a world of difference, between measured productivity and retail service. In the paper, which will be available in finished form in about a week, I can distribute if you're interested, I go into much more detail about this problem. But here's the kind of summary. Productivity is supposed to capture the economic efficiency with which a society transforms inputs into outputs. Right? That's what we wanted to measure. But standard measures of output, which are really just quantity by price, do not systematically account for difference. Now, everybody knows that when it comes to computers. Right? We all know that. We all know if the quality of a product or service is higher now than in the past, then real output will be understated, right? So if the power of your computer, which may cost less in terms of price than it would have 25 years ago, if you just measure productivity in terms of price by quantity, you're massively understating productivity growth because you're not accounting for the fact that its power is 300 times what it was. And so we know that in computers and other digital technologies, and we're trying, the economics profession is trying to change that by using hedonic price methods, right? So by saying, let's look at what products actually mean to people, the basket of services that they offer the person, like technological power, and let's change our pricing. Let's use a hedonic price index rather than the actual prices we pay for computers. But this is very hard to do. There are all kinds of controversies about hedonic methods. But this, in any case, is at the stage of experimentation with a few different technologies, like computers. And we are nowhere near even talking about this in any kind of concrete way in the service sector. Retailing being the most important example, given its overwhelming size for employment and other things too. So one problem is that we don't have good measures of service in retail services like many other services. And the second problem is that if you push an economist on this who works on retail productivity, some of them have actually come out recently and really acknowledged this in a very direct way, but others will say, yeah, okay, so we can't really measure retail service. But we assume that because people go to Walmart, what they're offered there embodies what they want, right? The kind of reveal preference argument. And so in some sense, customers have chosen what they're being offered by global retailers. And they worry about this assumption only when there's not enough competition. Right? So they say, so long as there's competition and more competition, then we don't have to worry about this because then customers get a range of possibilities. They can choose which ones they want. And say if you take the United States, there is plenty of competition. Walmart doesn't control 80% of the retail market. The problem is, what they ignore is the possibility that there are other systematic reasons, or else they never go shopping, why major retailers may all converge on a particular type of model of retail service that actually gives you very little choice at all. So I encourage you, whatever country you live in, to go into whatever your leading mass retailer is and try and buy organic spinach. How will you find it? At least if you're French, you're German, you're Dutch, you're Swiss, you're British, you're American. I think they're the ones I've done recent surveys on.
I live in Norway, they don't have that.
Organic spinach.
Really, you have to pay so much.
Okay, anybody? Organic spinach. It applies to many other organic.
Black market Greece, basically.
Okay. Okay, if you buy, so you either go to a farmer's market, but I didn't allow you to do that. I said go into a modern retailer. Always in a plastic bag. Always. Why? I mean, I actually say that. I'm not quite sure I know the answer to that question. This is a huge controversy among, so the kind of people who buy organic ask these questions, right? They're interested in organic food. They don't want plastic on the food that they buy, right? Usually it's part of a whole view about ecological blah, blah. Fine. So why do the retailers put them in plastic bags? Because then there's a barcode on the bag, so they can scan them. Okay, that's lower retail worker involvement. And two, it preserves them for longer, right? So from a retailer point of view, this makes sense. But from the point of view of the customers who want this stuff, it makes no sense at all. So if you go and Google, in whatever language you use, organic spinach or organic food, organic vegetables, and plastic bags, there is a stream of debate about this in most, with responses. So in Switzerland, for example, Migros and Co-op, which basically control the whole retail market, have this whole kind of discussion about why they do this. But if you read it with a critical eye, it's because it suits them. And customers will put up with it. That's just a sort of a trivial example to say that at least we should worry that this might be the case. So this, I think, leads to a very clear implication. This is one way of putting it from Ben Fine. You probably know, some of you, his work. Marxist economist. This, by the way, if you haven't read it, you might want to look at, which is his relatively new book from Pluto Press called Microeconomics, A Critical Companion. where he goes through all the major elements of an economics training and gives a kind of explanation of how the mainstream view looks and then some criticisms, useful for learning both, by the way. And he says, look, the analysis of consumption, of how retail consumers consume, can't be divorced from the system of production. In this case, how retail service is produced, not just because they set prices, which is what most economists worry about, are prices monopolized, but also because they're driven by the imperative of profitability. That leads to changes in the nature of what's provided. So because they're capitalists, it may be that they're willing to do some things and not others. So that's what I do in the bulk of the paper. You'd never think it from the amount of intro this took, is to say, let's go look at how profits and capital work in retail capitalism, at least in part. Now, having listened to me blathering on about economic theory for a while, you say, so smarty pants, what does profit and capital mean then? So, as you know, this is a question of huge complexity. And so my solution is don't ask an economist. Okay, ask a capitalist. So an economist can't give you a coherent answer to this question, and that's true of me too. I mean, I have ideas. But rather than getting into all of that, just get down to the point of asking a capitalist, what's the meaning of capital in the context of your business? How does it work? How do you make profits? How do you know if you're profitable? And by looking at how capitalists do this, I'm trying to persuade you that you can learn a whole lot about how contemporary capitalism works. And it's much scarier than you think. Okay, so if you open a Walmart annual report or a Carrefour annual report or any of these leading global retailers, they give extremely simple answers to the question of what capital is. There is no complication. It's some version of this, which has been around in explicit form since the early 20th century, and in implicit form for longer than that, so it's return on assets. And the second measure they'll give you is some measure of shareholder capital, some market value typically of shareholder capital. Now, if you're interested in understanding the influence of financial capital measures, of being measured in terms of financial measures of capital, and they're huge, read Cédric Durand. All right, he's written along with, I've forgotten, no. He's got two different co-authors, and I've forgotten their names for a second. But just go, he's a piece in the Socioeconomic Review with, anyone remember, Cécile? What's her surname? Gosh. Huh? Céline. No, I'll find it. No, it's not her. No, it's not her. Anyway, Cédric Durand, he's at Paris 13. He's written, it's called Financialization of Global Retailing or something, and he goes systematically through, or they go systematically through major global retailers, much the kind of people I'm going to be talking about for a few minutes, and really looks at the effect of financialization. Now, interestingly, Walmart is not one that comes out looking particularly bad. In some sense, if you just have a financialization lens, no big crisis about Walmart. So I love that paper, but there's something wrong if that's the answer, right? So what I'm going to look at here is, if you like, real capital. The capitalists are interested in looking at how their business works, in measuring return on assets, right? That's a business measure of profitability, looking at the internal workings of business. And I hope I can show you that even this kind of capitalism, the old-fashioned, enduring capitalism that always comes along with financial capital, is a problem too. Yeah.
Is it because it's family-owned? It's because Walmart is
exactly,
family-owned?
Exactly, and that's actually a big issue in retail capitalism in general. Think of Aldi.
No, but I mean, it's the reason why it doesn't come out so bad from a financial perspective, right?
But so, if you had data for Aldi,
yeah.
which we don't because it's the most secretive company in the world besides Cargill, you also wouldn't see a problem.
Yeah, but it's owned by the family.
51% is still owned by.
Yeah.
So therefore, it doesn't have the same diffusion of shareholding that usually precedes a big financial
They don't have
institution.
the power.
Yeah. So it's not an unknown thing, but it's not. Okay. Now, when you look at this, and I'm going to, the last time I've only given this once before, as you probably can tell from how, I gave it to a group of historians, political scientists, art historians, and archaeologists. So if it's a little bit too simple for you, I'm sorry. But I also think there's a value in this kind of simplicity, in really getting down to very simple ideas about how profits and capital work. Okay, so here's return on assets. So the first question is, let's look at profits. Now, in a former life, my dream was to be an accountant or an actuary. So I love this kind of stuff. But what we're looking at here is just a profit and loss statement. That's where profits come from. It looks more or less the same for any retailer you take. You've got gross profits. Gross profits are simply your revenues after your cost of goods sold. Then you take off your selling, general, administrative costs. You get an operating profit. Take off taxes. You get a net profit. Right? I just need you to recognize that these types of profits are slightly different depending on which costs you're taking off. Okay, so here now is the hard part, or at least the part that required work. What I did is I went back to 1969, which is the earliest date for which we have public data available for Walmart. And the whole exercise here is precisely to use public data. I do a lot of archival work, including in enterprises as a historian. And what I'm trying to do with this project is to show you don't need to do that. You can already say a lot using these very imperfect public statements, but quite revealing nevertheless. So the first thing to note here is that Walmart's on top. Why is that important? So this is Costco, for which we've less, because it's been in business for less time, and of that time we have less data. What do you notice about this picture? So it reaches a high of, the top is 4.5%.
Really downward trend for Walmart and upward trend for Costco.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'd call it a trend for Walmart, but you went through a period of higher profits, then it's come down, and then there's kind of volatility. Yeah, okay? But notwithstanding that fact, that Costco looks a bit healthier in terms of its directional trend, what is, yeah?
If Costco was paying higher wages, it might not be the argument that Walmart had before, that they couldn't afford the high wage.
Yeah, or this is Furman's argument. He says they have razor-thin margins. Well, that's not true, right? So relative to something, what is it? Well, Costco's a good example. Costco's much thinner margins than Walmart has. So this already tells you that this is not what I need to look at more, right? There's something going on here. So Walmart, from this point of view, is, interestingly enough, it comes out of this looking like a, hang on a second, just let me get my notes. What might be behind this higher profit margin for Walmart? How's it doing this?
Bargaining power with suppliers, mostly due to scale.
Right, so we can, I mean, we're really kind of speculating now, but we can speculate that one of two things is going on, and probably both. Either, in some kind of relative sense, it's squeezing somebody more than other retailers are squeezing them. That could be workers, it could be suppliers. Okay? Or it's actually potentially, despite all of its public relations and marketing, it could be gouging consumers by charging higher prices. So it's either one of those things. And we'll come back to this in the end, because in fact that's what Aldi has accused Walmart of doing, of charging high prices. So this is already kind of interesting that they're doing this, whereas you might say that, well, Costco is passing on more of its cost advantage to its consumers, and that's why its margins are much thinner. So we can speculate, but I don't have evidence. It's very hard to get evidence on this because Walmart does not report its employee costs. Right? You don't have to do you don't even have to report the total amount, but you don't have to necessarily report the total amount in relationship to the hours worked or number of employees even. So what we're looking at is how much money do these companies make as merchants. What's a merchant? A merchant is somebody who buys low and sells high. That's all. You can be a merchant without being a capitalist, in my sense of the word, and you'll see that in a second. So we see that Walmart is a successful merchant, a more successful merchant than Costco is. But we're not looking at the whole picture. So if we want to look at the return on capital, we also have to look at the denominator. And that begs the question of what are the assets of a retailer? Again, think about asking them. What kind of assets do retailers need?
The land,
Huh?
the real estate, the land.
Yeah, so shops, which they usually, in this particular case, they actually usually own. Trucks, distribution, which is a big deal in retailing today, and?
Inventory?
And inventory, right? So we have the fixed assets, which is what we call them, the trucks, anything that lasts more than a year, and then the merchandise they actually sell, which they need to hold in the shop for a certain period of time, in order to have the customer come in and buy it. Now, I'm just going to go straight to, in some sense, the answer, which is now I'm looking at the same but on a different scale. That's 16% now. Now, this is Walmart's net margin, and this is Walmart's return on assets. And this is Costco's net margin. You've seen these two things before. And now this is Costco's return on assets. Okay, a lot of volatility in these pictures, but what does this tell me, this picture? And I'm going to need to help you a little bit more, I think, but probably from this picture you can already see it. This is not the same picture. This picture suggests a different relationship between the two companies than their merchant profits would suggest. Now what's going on if you look at the two of them and the distance between them, what would you say?
There's a wider gap between between Walmart's two lines.
Well, there's a steadier gap, right? There's not a whole lot going on in terms of merchants, right? They're pretty much similarly apart for an enduring period of time. There's a lot more action over here, and actually Costco, despite the fact that there's not very much movement here, is moving in on Walmart in a big way. So this tells you only, but it's important, is that understanding how a retail operation works as a merchant and as a capitalist are two different things. Right? There's a relationship between them, but they're not the same thing. Okay, so that already tells us something. And now I want to do this, which is to break this down. So now I'm going to say, all right, if I just break this out, very simple algebra. We've already looked at this, and I've picked 1 year, I think it's 2010. And now we're looking at, the two of them are very, very close. Now I break this, basically all I do is I add sales. And now I've got profit over sales, that's merchant profit, net margin. And here I see what we saw before, Walmart is ahead of Costco. What makes the difference and what allows Costco to be closer to Walmart, better capitalist than you would expect from its merchant performance, is this, its relationship to sales over assets. Now, what is sales over assets in the economist language? What are the sales of an economy? Again, this is crude, but no. How do you measure the capital output ratio? What's the formula? Capital over output, right? So what's this? It's the inverted capital output ratio, right? So what am I looking at? Am I looking at capital intensity? No, but I'm looking at velocity. I'm looking at how quickly these capitalists turn their capital. Now, economists think about capital intensity. That's not the way capitalists think about it for the last century. What do they think about? Capital intensity is a burden on their business. The more capital you have, the more profit you have to make. So they, in fact, look at the opposite. How quickly do you drive your capital through your business? How much business do you do on your capital? So sales over assets, if you just look at this picture, the faster you make your capital turn, the bigger your return on capital is going to be. And what Costco is doing is it's learned how to drive its capital harder than Walmart. The question is, has that been true forever? How is that true? Yeah, Max.
Does this mean that they entice customers to buy more at a time? They move goods faster through stores?
Okay, so let's look, because there are two possibilities, right? We talked about where, I think I have a picture of it.
Sorry, I think it's like for a lot of people here in Europe, they are not familiar with the concept of Costco, and I think it's a fundamental thing to look into when we're talking about a comparison between Walmart and Costco, because Costco is first of all not targeted at like the general public as Walmart is. It's usually a higher end type of product, and it's usually sold in bulk, or let's say something between wholesale and
So it's more like Aldi. It's more like Aldi than Walmart.
yeah, so you go and you cannot buy a normal small peanut butter size. You get 4, or you get a very big jug with a lot of peanut butter. And I think that's also why it's easier for them to move a lot more merchandise, or I guess it's also the different type of control that they can have in their value chain. That it's different to Walmart.
So I'm okay with that argument, so long as we get to the end of the discussion and say there are structural limits to the possibilities of making higher profits because there's only so many Costco's that a retail market can take, or something like that. But I'm not willing to make it as an assumption. So you can come back at the end and make the argument as to why I, as an economist, should care about these details. I'm being deliberately provocative, right? Most economists don't pay any attention to the way in which merchandising works, for example. And I think the question for me is, to understand the source of profits on capital, do we have to get to that level as economists? Right? If I want to run a retail company, sure I do. But I'm not sure I need to go to that level of detail to do this kind of analysis. So push me on that in a second. But first of all, I want to understand Costco, because the question is, how's it doing this? Where is this coming from? And to do that, we need to break down assets. Right? So what are their assets? So there are two, we said. Fixed assets, mostly stores, but not just, and inventories. And this, I think, gets closer to what you're arguing, because when we look at the size of these assets, and again, this is Walmart, but Costco looks pretty similar. Here is property and equipment, and there is inventory. So inventories are very big. They're not as big as fixed assets, but they're half as big as fixed assets. So they matter. So then the question is, how come Costco, at least in 1 year, is better at turning its assets than Walmart? Is it because more people buy in each shop? Or is it because it sells more inventory compared to the amount of inventory it stocks? Either of those two things could be going on. And again, just to make it simple, I take 1 year. If you break it out, here are asset turns. And what do we see from this picture? Where is the difference? And we're only looking at these two right now, right? In some sense, we're not interested in these two at all. We're just interested in the logic. So why does Costco have higher asset turns than Walmart in 2016? And when I say asset, it doesn't look like that much until you think in percentage terms, right? This leverages your return on capital, so this is a big difference. Where does the difference come from? It's better at both, right? It's better at both. Turns its fixed assets faster. It's got more people buying in its shops per dollar invested in square footage, and it's turning its inventories more rapidly. Now, we can speculate on the reasons for that. And so, for example, where would your argument show up? It would show up probably in inventory turns, right? Costco stocks an extremely limited range of products, just like Aldi. You can buy tons of that stuff, but you can't buy anything else. Walmart stocks every major branded product, so it has 10,000 stock-keeping units compared to 1,000. Now, that might be one reason for it, but let's look at the change over time in a second. So the conclusion, just based on this very simple bilateral comparison, is Walmart makes more money as a merchant, higher profits on sales. Walmart makes less money as a capitalist. It turns its capital fixed and current more slowly, but it's a problem it's been addressing to rather dramatic effect since the mid-90s. I'm running out of time, so let me just try and... Okay, so I just want to show you the long view. So here we have sales over total assets, where you see not very much change. This is Walmart only. These are sales over fixed assets. So this is, if you like, on average, how much sales does Walmart generate out of $1 invested in its stores? What you see is signs of overexpansion. Right? It's opening too many stores. It's got so many stores in the United States that it's cannibalizing itself, its own stores. But in addition, we see a flat inventory turn here right up to 1995, and then a massive improvement, and then a stabilization. So what this shows is we've got to be very careful looking at 1 year. Right? There's a lot going on as far as this company is concerned. And this, I can't persuade you of this, but let me summarize the argument. If by technology you mean barcodes, tracking technology, containerization, then technology is a bad explanation for the patterns we see. Because if you want to explain change, then you need variables that change. And those variables don't really change. They're to be found in the real variables that change. So, for example, barcode scanning technology has been around for a very long time. So that can't explain these kinds of trends in inventory turns.
Just to mention, 1992 is the death of Sam Walton.
Right.
So there's a
Huge
turn
change.
in terms of cultural corporate culture.
And the question is, how does that get expressed in the way the company's managed? And in fact, that's exactly what happens. So where we find it, though, is going inside, into the innards of these companies and how they work to figure out what is going on. And the reason why we don't know very much about that is the kind of people who do that work tend to work at business schools, often tend to work for the companies or as consultants. It's not the kind of work that economists do because they find it undignified and actually kind of disgusting. Right? They don't really want to know how this works. It's too confusing or disgusting. So what I do in the paper, I can't possibly go through all this even really fast, so let me just say that what I do at this point is I blow it up. Stop looking at Costco and Walmart, which are really just used for the purposes of showing these very simple ideas about how capital generates profit on itself. And then using the case of not just Walmart, but lots of other companies, what you can see is there are similar trends for some of the American companies. Where's the other one? These ones, Target, Walmart, and Sears. What we don't find is similar trends for the grocers in the United States. And so what I end up doing, and most importantly, what we're looking at here is efficiency in inventories. This comes from Céline Beau, that's the name I was trying to remember. What you see is that if you look at a Tesco or a Carrefour, but especially a Tesco, what you find is they are much better at turning their inventories than the Americans. Much, much better. Now, the reasons for this have to do with, this is widely known, but that Aldi's secret is turning its inventories more rapidly than anybody else. This is commented on in the business press, a German chain that's beating Walmart at its own game, because where is it going now? It's going into the United States, where it's already present in a relatively small way through Trader Joe's, at least part of the company, and they're now doing an all-out attack on Walmart's profits by lowering prices. The basic argument I try to make, and I'll leave it at this, is that when you get into the logic of retail capitalism, you can identify a very systemic logic that pretty much all these retailers apply to make profits. It's almost in the accounting, right? They've got to either drive higher profits through merchant profits, charging higher prices or lowering wages, and or driving their assets as hard as they can. What that essentially means is offering us inducements to buy as much stuff as they can sell us, given the amount of inventory they hold. And the way they've done that since mid-90s in the United States is by mixing groceries with general merchandise and using groceries as a loss leader. This is a method pioneered by Carrefour a long time ago. What they do is they sell milk for 10 cents. They sell bottled water for 49 cents a bottle and lower. And they use the grocery business, which draws traffic into the shop, to encourage people to walk up and down the aisles in order to buy a microwave at the same time. Now, what I try to argue at the end of the paper is that this is an incredibly destructive logic. It breeds massive overconsumption. And it has enormous impacts on producers, in this particular case of groceries, that are driven to unsustainable practices in the production of, for example, salmon and chili, using ecological methods that would make you cry. So the argument ends up being, as consumers, you can beat your brow and say, I'm going to not shop at those places, or I'll try and opt out of some of the extremes of this behavior. But because this logic is so systemic, we're trapped. You cannot survive as a merchant against a capitalist. This is the biggest problem, because Aldi can drive down its profit margins to 0.5%, and so long as it turns its capital fast enough, it can compensate for 0.5% profit margin on the products it sells. That means no merchant who's not willing to play the capitalist game can survive. And what that means for the kind of retail environment we have in 10 years is horrifying. So it ends up being I suppose, a much more negative critique of retail capitalism than I think you might expect, but one I think that you can build pretty coherently, but read the paper and see. I haven't perhaps done it as much justice as I might, but you have been so patient with me, I certainly can't ask for any more time and have already asked for too much. Okay, so I hope that gives you a sense of the range of fun things you can do in capital. Thanks for your attention.